I need to make love, don't move. I need to make love.
Don't move. I need to make love now. The giant mail order. Bride to the shy, lonely cowboy, but what he did next shocked the entire town. The giant mail order bride knelt in the dirt. Margaret Carlson, who'd been told her whole life she was too much, too tall, too strong, was on her knees before the shy, lonely cowboy she'd married 3 days ago. Thomas Bridger looked down at his wife in her wedding dress, this woman who towered over him when she stood, now making herself small in the Montana dust outside their ranch. The entire town had laughed when she arrived, called her a freak, called him desperate. But what this shy, broken cowboy did next, how he responded to her kneeling, what he said, where he put his hands, it shocked her so deeply that night she'd whisper words she'd never said to any man. Don't move. I need to make love now. But to understand why she was kneeling, why her hands gripped his worn suspenders like a lifeline, you have to go back 3 days. Back to when Margaret stepped off that afternoon train into Dust Creek, Montana, and felt every dream she'd been foolish enough to carry die in her chest. The train hissed steam into the August heat. Margaret's traveling dress clung to her back, soaked through from 2 days of sitting upright in third class because the seats were too small for her frame. She'd memorized Thomas Bridger's letters, read them so many times the paper had worn soft at the creases. He wrote about his land, about the mountains, about how lonely the silence got after his family died. He never wrote about love, but he wrote about needing someone. And Margaret, who'd been rejected by 3 men back in Minnesota, who'd watched her own father call her God's mistake, she understood needing someone. She gripped her small trunk with both hands and descended the train steps. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The platform kept getting lower. She was used to this, the moment when people's faces changed from curiosity to shock to something ugly. Thomas stood 20 feet away. He was smaller than she'd imagined. Narrow shoulders under a faded work shirt, hands that wouldn't stop fidgeting with his hat brim, brown hair that needed cutting. But his eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers, they were the saddest eyes she'd ever seen. The crowd behind him started whispering. Then someone laughed, a man's voice loud and cruel. Jesus Christ, Bridger. You order that from a circus catalog? More laughter. Margaret's face burned. She'd heard worse, but something about this moment, standing in her best dress in front of the man she'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry, made her want to sink into the platform boards and disappear. Thomas's face went white. His hands stopped moving. For 3 seconds that felt like hours, he just stared at her. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading since she sealed her response letter. He was going to send her back, tell her there'd been a mistake, hand her train fare and apologize to his friends for wasting their time with this joke. But then Thomas Bridger did something Margaret had never seen a man do. He walked toward her, not away, toward. His boots made small clouds in the dust. He stopped close enough that she could smell soap and leather and honest sweat. Close enough that he had to crane his neck back to see her face. His hand came up, shaking so badly she thought he might be sick, and he pulled off his hat. Miss Carlson, he said. His voice cracked on her name. I'm glad you're real. The words didn't make sense. Margaret blinked, confused. Real? I thought maybe I dreamed you up. Thomas's eyes were wet. Thought maybe I wanted someone so bad I'd invented your letters. But you're here. You're really here. Behind them, the laughter died. Someone coughed. Margaret heard boots shuffling away. Thomas held out his arm, the formal way, like gentlemen did in books. May I carry your trunk, ma'am? Margaret couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up completely. She just nodded. He took her trunk like it weighed nothing, even though she'd packed her whole life in there. Then he offered his arm again. The preacher's expecting us. If that's still what you want, if you haven't changed your mind. Changed my mind. The words came out hoarse. You're here now. You've seen the town, seen me. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. I'd understand if you wanted to take the next train out. I'd pay your fare back, plus extra for your trouble. I know this isn't what you probably hoped for. Margaret looked at this small, sad cowboy who thought she might reject him, who was offering to pay for her to leave before she'd even seen his land, who just walked toward her while his whole town laughed. I haven't changed my mind, she whispered. Thomas's whole body sagged with relief. Then let's get you married before you do. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. Preacher Morris read from his worn Bible in a voice that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. His wife served as witness, along with old Samuel from the livery stable. No one else came. The whole town of Dust Creek had better things to do than watch the cursed cowboy marry his giant mistake. Margaret wore her traveling dress because her trunk was still in Thomas's wagon. Thomas wore the same work clothes from the station. When Preacher Morris told him to place the ring, Thomas's hands shook so badly he dropped it twice. The ring was thin gold, probably his mother's, Margaret realized. It barely fit over her knuckle. I now pronounce you man and wife. Preacher Morris snapped his Bible shut. You may kiss the bride. Thomas froze. His face went crimson. He looked at Margaret, then at the floor, then at the preacher, like maybe he'd misheard. It's all right, Margaret said quietly. She'd been through this before, the awkward moment when men realized they'd have to stretch up to reach her mouth. We don't have to. But Thomas stepped closer. He rose up on his toes. His hand touched her elbow, so gently she barely felt it. And he pressed his lips to hers, quick and dry and terrified, but he did it. When he stepped back, his ears were burning red. Sorry, he muttered. I don't have much practice with. It's fine, Margaret said, and meant it. They walked to his wagon in silence. Thomas helped her up, his hands on her waist, barely spanning half of it, and climbed up beside her. The wagon seat was small. Their shoulders touched. The ranch is 4 miles out, Thomas said, snapping the reins. The horse started forward. It's not fancy, just a house and a barn and some land, but it's honest work, clean water, good soil. Margaret nodded. She didn't trust her voice yet. They rode past Main Street. People stopped to stare. Margaret heard whispers floating through open windows, saw curtains twitch, felt eyes on her back like physical weight. Thomas's jaw clenched tighter with every block. When they finally left town behind, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Mountains rose purple in the distance. The sky stretched bigger than anything Margaret had ever seen in Minnesota. Can I ask you something? Thomas's voice was so quiet she almost missed it. Yes. Why'd you answer my advertisement? He still wouldn't look at her. A woman like you. You could have had your pick. Why come all the way out here for someone like me? Margaret watched the mountains for a long moment. I told you in my letters about my height. You did. Did you believe me when I wrote that I was over 6 feet tall? I believed you. And you still wanted me to come. Now Thomas did look at her. His eyes were fierce suddenly, almost angry. I didn't want you to come. In spite of being tall, Mrs. Bridger, I just wanted you to come. Something in Margaret's chest cracked open. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it felt different now, less empty. When they pulled up to his ranch house, small and weathered but neat, with a garden plot and a good barn, Thomas helped her down, His hands lingered on her waist for just a second longer than necessary. "I'll show you inside," he said. "You can have the bedroom. I'll sleep in the barn until you're comfortable." "The barn," Margaret repeated. "I don't want you to feel pressured. I know we're married in the eyes of the law, but I can wait, however long you need. I'm a patient man." He meant it. Margaret could see it in his face. This shy, lonely cowboy was prepared to sleep in his barn indefinitely rather than make her uncomfortable. And that's when it hit her. The full weight of what she'd done. She'd married a complete stranger, traveled 2,000 miles to a town that hated her, to live with a man she'd known for 7 minutes. "I need to be alone," she said suddenly. "Just for a few hours. I need to think." Thomas nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll be in the barn if you need anything. There's food in the pantry, water in the pump. Take all the time you need." He walked away before she could respond. Margaret stood in the Montana dust, watching him disappear into the barn, and wondered what in God's name she'd just done. The house was smaller inside than it looked. One main room with a cook stove and table, a bedroom barely big enough for the iron bed frame and dresser. Everything was clean but worn, the kind of clean that comes from a man with too much time and too much grief trying to keep his hands busy. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin, but the quilt was beautiful, hand-stitched with a pattern of blue stars. His mother's work, probably. Or maybe a sister's. She ran her fingers over the stitching and felt the weight of all the dead people in this house pressing down on her shoulders. Through the window she could see the barn, could picture Thomas in there, sitting on a hay bale, probably wondering what he'd gotten himself into. She should feel relieved. Most men would have expected their rights on the wedding night. Waited or not, Thomas was giving her space, giving her time, asking for nothing. So why did she feel so hollow? Margaret stood and walked to the small mirror above the dresser. Her reflection stared back, dark hair escaping its pins, face flushed from sun and nerves, shoulders that wouldn't fit through most doorways. She'd spent 26 years trying to make this body smaller, quieter, less. And she was so tired of it. The sun was setting now, painting the mountains gold and orange. Margaret had been alone in the house for 3 hours. Her stomach growled, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. Couldn't bring herself to explore the pantry like she had a right to be here. A knock on the doorframe made her jump. Thomas stood in the doorway, not inside, just at the threshold. "I brought you water from the well. Thought you might be thirsty." He set the bucket down and turned to leave. "Wait," Margaret said. The word came out sharper than she intended. Thomas froze. "You don't have to sleep in the barn," she said. "This is your house, your bed. I can't ask you to give up your own home." "You didn't ask. I offered." Thomas still wouldn't look at her. "And I meant what I said. I can wait." Wait for what, exactly? The question surprised her as much as him. "Wait for me to be comfortable. I'm 6'3", Mr. Bridger. I've never been comfortable a day in my life." Now he did look at her. "Then what do you want?" "I want to know why." Margaret's voice shook. "Why did you send for a mail-order bride? Why did you pick me when I told you the truth about what I look like? Why did you walk toward me at that train station when everyone was laughing?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped inside, just barely, and closed the door behind him. 3 years ago, my whole family died," he said. "Cholera took them in 6 days. Ma, Pa, both my sisters. Sarah was 16, Emma was 12. I buried them up on the rise behind the house where they can see the mountains." Margaret's throat tightened. "Folks in town started avoiding me after that. Said I was cursed. Said death followed me. I stopped going to church because people would move to different pews. Stopped going to the general store unless I had to because shopkeepers would count my change twice, like maybe I'd steal from them. His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who'd told this story to himself too many times. I worked the land, fed the animals, fixed the fence, and every night I'd sit in this house, and the silence would get so loud I thought I'd go crazy. Thomas finally met her eyes. So I wrote an advertisement. Didn't think anyone would answer. Didn't think I deserved anyone to answer. But you did. I answered because no one else wanted me, Margaret said quietly. I answered because I was desperate. I know. Thomas's smile was sad. But you still answered. And your letters... Margaret, your letters were the only thing that made me feel like maybe I wasn't cursed. Maybe I was just lonely. The way he said her name, like it was something precious, made her chest ache. When you stepped off that train, he continued, I saw every person in town looking at you the way they look at me. Like you were wrong somehow. Different. Not quite right. And I thought maybe you'd understand what it's like to be the person everyone crosses the street to avoid. Margaret sat back down on the bed. Her legs suddenly wouldn't hold her. I don't know how to be a husband, Thomas said. I don't know what I'm doing. But I know I don't want you to feel the way I've felt for 3 years. I don't want you to sit in this house and drown in the silence. So if you need me to sleep in the barn to make that happen, I'll do it. And if I don't want to be alone? The words came out before Margaret could stop them. Thomas went very still. Then I'll stay. The space between them felt electric suddenly. Dangerous. Margaret stood, walked toward him. She had to look down to meet his eyes, always had to look down. With everyone, but for the first time in her life it didn't feel like a curse. I'm afraid, she whispered. Of me? Of this? Of making a mistake? Of you waking up tomorrow and realizing you married the wrong person? Thomas reached up, slowly giving her time to pull away, and touched her face. His hand was rough with calluses, but his touch was so gentle it made her want to cry. I watched my whole family die, he said. I know what real mistakes look like. And Margaret, you're not a mistake. She kissed him then, bent down and pressed her mouth to his. Not the quick, terrified kiss from the ceremony, but something real, something that tasted like need and hope and 3 years of loneliness on both sides. Thomas made a sound low in his throat. His hands came up to her waist, gripping hard like maybe he was afraid she'd disappear. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. The town, Margaret said. They're going to make this harder. Make us harder. Let them. Thomas's voice was fierce now. Let them talk. Let them stare. I don't care anymore. You say that now. I mean it. He pulled her closer, his face pressed against her collarbone, because that's where he could reach. I've spent 3 years being afraid of what people think. I'm done being afraid. Margaret's hands came up to his hair. It was softer than she expected. I don't know how to do this either. Be a wife. Be normal. Then we'll figure it out together. Thomas looked up at her, and the want in his eyes made her breath catch. But Margaret, I need you to know something. I need you to understand. What? You're not too much, his voice cracked. You're not too tall or too strong or too different. You're exactly right, exactly what I needed. And if the whole town of Dust Creek has a problem with that, they can go straight to hell. Margaret had been rejected her whole life, by her father, by suitors, by strangers who took one look and decided she wasn't worth their time. She'd learned to make herself small, to apologize for existing, to kneel in the dirt if that's what it took to be wanted. But Thomas Bridger, this shy, broken cowboy who could barely string 2 sentences together in public, he saw her. All of her. And he wasn't asking her to be less. Don't move, she whispered. Her hands trembled as she reached for the buttons of his shirt. I need to make love now. Thomas's eyes went wide. Margaret, please. The word broke in her throat. I need to know this is real. I need to know you really want me. I do want you. His hands covered hers, stilling them. But not because you're trying to prove something. Not because you're afraid I'll change my mind. Then why? Thomas pulled her hands to his mouth, kissed her knuckles one by one. Because you're my wife. Because I've been half dead for 3 years, and you make me feel alive. Because when I look at you, I see the bravest person I've ever met. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. I'm not brave. You crossed an ocean to marry a stranger. You stood in that town square while people laughed at you, and you didn't run. You're here right now even though you're terrified. Thomas's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Margaret, you're the bravest person I know, and I want you, all of you, but only when you're ready. She was ready. God help her. She'd never been more ready for anything in her life. Margaret pulled him toward the bed. Thomas went willingly, his eyes never leaving her face. When her knees hit the mattress, she sat, and for the first time in her life, she was nearly eye level with the man standing before her. There you are, Thomas breathed, wonder in his voice. He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. His hands moved to the buttons of her dress, clumsy and shaking but determined. Margaret helped him, her own hands just as unsteady. The last light of sunset painted them both gold through the window. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The mountains watched, ancient and impartial. And in that small house full of ghosts and grief, 2 lonely people reached for each other in the dark and found something like salvation. Morning came too bright through the thin curtains. Margaret woke tangled in Thomas's arms, his breath warm against her shoulder. For 3 perfect seconds she felt safe. Then reality crashed back and her stomach dropped. What had they done? What had she done? Thomas stirred, his hand tightening on her waist. Morning, he mumbled, voice rough with sleep. Margaret couldn't answer. Her throat had closed up completely. Because last night in the dark, wrapped in need and desperation, she'd forgotten the most important thing. The town. Dust Creek was watching, waiting. And she'd just given them exactly what they expected. The giant freak and the cursed cowboy, proving everyone right. Margaret! Thomas propped himself up on one elbow. What's wrong? We need supplies, she said, pulling away from him. The air felt cold where his body had been. Flour, coffee. I saw the pantry yesterday. You're almost out. I can go to town later. I'll go. She stood, reaching for her dress. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't work the buttons. I should learn where things are. Meet people. Thomas sat up, the quilt pooling at his waist. Margaret, you don't have to. I'm your wife now. The words came out harder than she meant. I should pull my weight, do my share. She could feel him watching her, trying to understand what had changed between last night and this morning. But how could she explain? How could she tell him that lying in his arms had felt like home, and that terrified her more than anything? Because homes could be taken away. Safety could disappear in 6 days, like his family. And Margaret had learned a long time ago that the moment you started believing you deserved something good, that's when it got ripped away. Then I'll come with you, Thomas said quietly. No. Margaret finally got her dress buttoned. You have work to do here. I can handle the general store. Margaret. I'll be fine, Thomas. I've dealt with worse than Dust Creek. She left before he could argue, walking the 4 miles into town with the morning sun already burning hot on her shoulders. The money Thomas had given her felt heavy in her pocket. The list of supplies felt heavier. Harlow's general store sat in the middle of Main Street like a squat toad. Through the window, Margaret could see people inside, women in neat dresses, men in clean shirts. Normal people living normal lives. She pushed open the door. The bell above chimed bright and cheerful. Every conversation stopped. Mrs. Harlow looked up from behind the counter, her smile freezing in place. Two women near the fabric bolts went silent mid-sentence. A man by the tobacco turned to stare. "Morning," Margaret said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need flour and coffee. Maybe some salt if you have it." Mrs. Harlow's eyes darted to her husband, then back to Margaret. "Of course, dear. Let me just—" She moved like she was walking through mud, slow, reluctant. Margaret stood by the counter, feeling every eye in the store on her back. Then the door opened behind her, and Eb Tucker walked in. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face that looked like he enjoyed other people's pain. He stopped when he saw Margaret, and his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "If it isn't Bridger's new purchase, how's married life, giantess?" Margaret's face burned, but she kept her voice level. "My name is Mrs. Bridger, Mr. Tucker, and married life is just fine, thank you." Eb circled her like a predator studying prey. "Just fine? That's all? I figured a woman your size would break poor Tom in half on the wedding night." His friends by the door howled with laughter. Or maybe he couldn't even reach. Maybe he needed a stepladder just to— "That's enough, Eb." Mrs. Harlow's voice was weak, but it was something. "I'm just making conversation," Eb said, eyes never leaving Margaret. "Just wondering how it works exactly, with someone so unnatural." The word hit like a physical blow. Margaret had heard it before, from her father, from rejected suitors, from strangers on the street. But somehow, standing in this store 3 days after giving herself to Thomas, after letting herself hope for just one night that maybe she could be wanted, the word cut deeper than it ever had. Her hands trembled as she reached for the counter. She needed to leave, needed to get out before she broke down in front of these people. But her legs wouldn't move. "I bet Tom's already regretting it," Eb continued, warming to his theme. "Bet he wakes up every morning wondering what possessed him to order himself a circus freak when he could have—" The door slammed open so hard it cracked against the wall. Thomas Bridger stood in the doorframe, and Margaret barely recognized him. The shy, quiet man from yesterday was gone. His face was white with fury, his hands were clenched into fists, and his eyes looked ready to kill. He walked straight past everyone else, walked straight to Margaret. And then, in the center of Harlow's general store, with the whole town watching, Thomas Bridger dropped to his knees. The store went completely silent. Thomas took Margaret's hand, her large, work-roughened hand, in both of his. He looked up at her with tears streaming down his face, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room. "Margaret Carlson Bridger," he said, loud and clear, and not shy at all. "You are the answer to every prayer I didn't know how to say. You are the bravest woman I have ever met, and I thank God every single morning that I wake up that you chose me." Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare down at this man kneeling before her in the dirt and sawdust of the general store floor. Then Thomas pressed his lips to her knuckles, a long, deliberate kiss that made Mrs. Harlow gasp and someone in the back whisper, "Lord have mercy." He stood slowly, never letting go of her hand, turned to face Eb Tucker with an expression that could freeze fire. "Her supplies go on my account," Thomas said quietly, dangerously. "Every week, for the rest of our lives, her supplies go on my account. And Eb, if you or any other man in this town has something to say about my wife—" His voice dropped even lower. You come say it to me, directly, and we'll settle it like men. Ebb's face went purple. You threatening me, Bridger? I'm making a promise. Thomas's hand tightened on Margaret's. Touch her, insult her, even look at her wrong, and you'll answer to me. That goes for everyone here. He turned back to Mrs. Harlow. The flour and coffee, please, and whatever else my wife needs. Mrs. Harlow moved fast now, packing supplies with shaking hands. No one else in the store moved. No one spoke. Thomas loaded the supplies into Margaret's arms, then took her free hand and walked her out of the store. They made it halfway to the wagon before Margaret's legs gave out. She sank to the dirt of Main Street, supplies scattering, and sobbed like something broken inside her was finally coming loose. Thomas knelt beside her, not in front of her this time, but next to her. Equal. Together. I'm sorry, he said, pulling her against his chest. I'm so sorry I wasn't there sooner. I should have come with you. I should have... You knelt. Margaret's voice was wrecked. In front of everyone, you knelt for me. Of course I did. Thomas pulled back to look at her face. Margaret, you've spent your whole life making yourself smaller for people who don't deserve you. I wanted them to see, I wanted you to see, that I will get on my knees for you. I will lower myself, humble myself, do whatever it takes to show you that you are worth everything to me. Margaret kissed him then, right there in the middle of Main Street, with half the town watching from windows. Kissed him like he was oxygen, and she'd been drowning her whole life. When they finally broke apart, Thomas helped her gather the scattered supplies, helped her into the wagon, drove them home in silence while Margaret's tears dried on her face. That night, lying in their bed with the windows open to let in the mountain air, Margaret finally understood what Thomas had been trying to tell her all along. She wasn't too much. She was exactly enough. And the shy, lonely cowboy who'd knelt for her in the dust, he was exactly enough too. 3 months later, the ranch had changed. Thomas built a bunkhouse for the women who started showing up. Women with nowhere else to go, women who didn't fit, women the town had given up on. Margaret took them in without hesitation, and Thomas never complained about the extra mouths to feed. The town still talked, but it was different now. Quieter, more careful. Because everyone in Dust Creek had learned something that day in the general store. Thomas Bridger might be shy and quiet and cursed by grief, but he would move heaven and earth for the giant woman he loved. And Margaret, the bride who'd arrived expecting rejection, she'd finally found the one place in the world where being herself was not just acceptable, but celebrated. Some nights, when the work was done and the women were settled in the bunkhouse, Thomas and Margaret would sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold. Do you ever regret it? Margaret asked one evening. Sending for a mail-order bride. Thomas pulled her close, her head resting on his shoulder in the way they'd learned to fit together. Every single day, he said. Margaret stiffened. I regret that I waited so long, Thomas continued. I regret every day I spent alone before you got here. But Margaret, I have never once regretted you. She turned to kiss him, and he met her halfway, no kneeling required, because they'd learned to find each other exactly as they were. Two people who'd been told their whole lives they were too much and not enough, proving everyone wrong simply by choosing each other every single day. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that being different isn't being wrong, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story about love that defies expectations. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What part of this story spoke to your soul? Because love like Thomas and Margaret's, the kind that kneels in the dust and stands up in public and refuses to make itself smaller, that kind of love is worth remembering. And there are more untold stories waiting to be shared. Stories about people who didn't fit and the ones who loved them anyway. Subscribe and let's discover them together.